October 1964. The dream of Simon and Garfunkel is dead. Their first album, a quiet, respectful collection of folk songs titled Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., has been released to almost complete and total indifference. It is a commercial ghost. In its first 3 months, it sells less than 3,000 copies. In the bustling marketplace of American pop, this number is not just a failure. It's a non-entity. It's a rounding error. Paul Simon, its principal songwriter, has given up and moved to England, resigned to a modest life as a transient folk singer in the smoky, damp clubs of London. Art Garfunkel has gone back to Columbia University to resume his studies in mathematics, trading the fragile hope of stardom for the solid certainty of academia. They are two young men, set adrift, but they are not alone. They are a perfect miniature of a nation that has also been set adrift, a nation suddenly, shockingly orphaned. Just 11 months earlier, a rifle shot in Dallas had torn a hole in the fabric of American optimism. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was not just the death of a man, it was the death of an illusion. The grainy 8mm horror of the Zapruder film, the muffled drums of the state funeral, the image of a nation weeping in public, the stoic, blood-stained grace of the First Lady. This was the new, shared reality. It was a trauma that left a void, a deafening silence that no one yet knew how to fill. So when their album failed, it made perfect sense. It was a quiet, acoustic whisper from a world that no longer existed, a world before the shot rang out. It was a relic of an age of innocence that had evaporated in a single, violent afternoon. Buried on that failed album, the very first track, was a song written by a 21-year-old in his parents' bathroom, a song of such stark, poetic vulnerability that it was almost embarrassing in its sincerity. It begins with a lyric, "Hello darkness, my old friend." This was The Sounds of Silence, and it was a certified flop. What Simon and Garfunkel didn't know, what the record label didn't know, was that this gentle acoustic failure was about to be the subject of an extraordinary act of artistic sabotage. They didn't know that the national tragedy had fundamentally rewired the American psyche, creating a void that this song, written before the trauma, was destined to fill. And they didn't know that a maverick producer, acting entirely on his own, would, without their permission, radically transform their gentle lament into the defining anthem of this new, disillusioned generation. This is the story of how a song died, was violently resurrected by a rogue act, and became the accidental soundtrack for a nation that had just lost its innocence. To understand the miracle of The Sound of Silence, you must first understand the world it failed in and the world it was reborn into. The two were separated by only a year, but they were different centuries. The America of early 1963 was a nation of profound, almost naive optimism. It was the era of John F. Kennedy's Camelot, a time of seemingly boundless confidence. The economy was booming, the culture was vibrant, and the new frontier felt like a tangible reality. The nation was looking forward, upward, toward the stars with the Mercury astronauts, with a charismatic young president as its guide. America saw itself as a shining city on a hill, a beacon of progress and freedom in a troubled world. It was a nation that believed in its own advertising. The popular music of the day reflected this spirit. The charts were filled with the soaring falsetto of the Four Seasons singing "Walk Like a Man," the clean-cut narratives of John and Dean, and the meticulously crafted joy of early Motown. The folk music scene, which was the intellectual heart of the youth culture, was itself dominated by groups like the Weavers and Peter, Paul, and Mary. Their music was earnest, clean-cut, and politically engaged, but its engagement was one of hopeful, righteous protest. They sang songs like "If I Had a Hammer," anthems of positive communal action, believing that songs could and would change the world for the better. Their harmonies were clean, their presentation collegiate. It was music for a march, not for a wake. Even the scene's reigning god, Bob Dylan, was still in his acoustic prophet phase, writing anthems like "Blowin' in the Wind," songs that asked questions but implied that answers and justice were certainly attainable. It was the sound of a generation that believed it could right any wrong, that the moral arc of the universe bent firmly toward justice. Into this world came Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, two friends from Queens, New York, who had been singing together since they were teenagers. They were not new to the music business. They had even had a minor hit in 1957, while still in high school, as Tom and Jerry, with a peppy, derivative pop song called "Hey Schoolgirl." It was a piece of bubblegum, a 2-minute slice of Everly Brothers imitation, perfectly of its time. But it was not art, and it was not who they wanted to be. It was a footnote they would spend years trying to erase, a youthful indiscretion that felt like a betrayal of the more serious artistic ambitions brewing within them. Paul Simon, in particular, was a student of the craft, absorbing everything from the intricate guitar work of folk masters to the tight song structures of Tin Pan Alley. By the early 1960s, they had embraced the sincerity and intellectualism of the Greenwich Village folk scene. They traded in their rock and roll affectations for acoustic guitars and turtlenecks. They were no longer Tom and Jerry. They were Simon and Garfunkel. They were signed to Columbia Records by the legendary producer Tom Wilson, a man who saw in them a genuine, if unpolished, talent. Their two voices blended with an almost supernatural purity, a harmonic lock that was a rare and beautiful instrument. Garfunkel's tenor was angelic, a pure, soaring sound, while Simon's was grounded, narrative, and knowing. They were, in many ways, the perfect avatars for the folk revival's sensitive, collegiate wing. Their first album was a perfect snapshot of that innocent era. Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m. is a beautiful, respectful, and utterly safe record. It's the sound of a coffee house, an auditory snapshot of the folk revival at its peak. The tracklist is telling. It was filled with traditional folk covers like Peggy-O, gospel standards like Go Tell It on the Mountain, and reverent covers of the new folk gods, including 3 Bob Dylan songs. Their version of "The Times They Are A-Changin'" is so polite, it almost sounds like a request, not a demand. The production is crystalline and sparse, just 2 voices in perfect angelic harmony, and 1 acoustic guitar, played with precision by Simon. It was a record that asked its listener to lean in, to be quiet, to pay attention. And then there was "The Sounds of Silence." Paul Simon had written the song in 1963, famously sitting in the tiled bathroom of his parents' house with the lights off, letting the dripping faucet provide a rhythm. He was 21 years old. The song was a work of startling maturity, a dense poetic meditation on the failure of human communication. It was a song about alienation, but it was the personal, almost adolescent alienation of a 21-year-old poet. It was a young man looking at the world and feeling disconnected from it. Let's look at the lyrics as they existed in that acoustic form. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again." This is the opening of an introvert, a solitary figure who finds comfort not in people, but in the absence of them. "Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping." This is the language of a dream, a private revelation. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. This is a song about an idea, an observation, something that exists only in the mind and in the quiet. The second verse: in restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, paints a picture of a pre-industrial, almost Dickensian world. It's a literary image, not a modern one. Neath the halo of a street lamp, I turned my collar to the cold and damp. This is a portrait of a solitary, romantic figure, the lonely artist. The flash of a neon light is not yet a god. It's just a light that stabbed the night and touched the sound of silence. It's a moment of jarring modernity, but the song's narrator is still an observer, detached. The third verse is where the social critique begins, but it's a social critique of the abstract. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening. This is a classic existential complaint about the superficiality of modern life. People writing songs that voices never share, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. It's a lament for a lack of true connection, a critique of apathy, but it is a philosophical one. The fourth verse: fools, said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach you. This is the 21-year-old prophet, the college sophomore who believes he has found the truth and is frustrated that no one will listen. He is literally shouting, but my words, like silent raindrops, fell and echoed in the wells of silence. He is unheard, his wisdom rejected. And the finale: and the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. This is a direct shot at commercialism, at false idols, at the emptiness of a society that worships material things. And the sign flashed out its warning in the words that it was forming. The song ends with this warning, this revelation, that the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls and whispered in the sound of silence. The truth is in the margins, in the places polite society ignores. It's a brilliant, dense, and deeply personal song. It's also, for 1964, profoundly out of step. When the album was released in October 1964, it landed with a dull thud. The world had changed. The Beatles had landed at JFK Airport in February of that year, just 77 days after Kennedy's assassination. The subsequent British invasion was a sonic tidal wave that wiped the slate clean. It wasn't just music. It was a distraction, a joyous, exuberant noise that America desperately needed. It was an escape from the somber dread that had enveloped the nation. The electric, ecstatic, and loud roar of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Animals had made polite acoustic folk music sound quaint, like a relic from a bygone era. The album's flaw was its own purity. It was too quiet, too gentle, too nice. It was a letter written in careful cursive, delivered to a generation that was now communicating in screams and electric guitar solos. The failure was so complete that the duo split. The story was over. The assassination of President Kennedy was the event that changed the frequency of the entire nation. It was the moment the 1950s truly ended, and the 1960s, the decade we now remember, truly began. The collective trauma was immense. This wasn't a distant battle. It was a public execution, broadcast into every home. For 4 days, the nation was united in a televised ritual of grief. The grainy 8mm horror of the Zapruder film, the iconic image of Walter Cronkite removing his glasses to announce the president's death, the endless, mournful loop of the funeral procession with its muffled drums. These images were seared into the national consciousness. This single event cracked the foundation of American optimism. The sense of boundless possibility and inherent national goodness was replaced by something new, something darker. Cynicism, paranoia, and a profound, collective disillusionment. The assassination was the first domino in a cascade of national traumas. The Warren Commission's report, which was meant to provide closure, instead fueled 1,000 conspiracy theories. Then came the escalation in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964, just 2 months before the album's release, gave President Johnson a blank check for war. In March 1965, the first major combat troops landed at Da Nang. The Berkeley free speech movement had erupted on college campuses, showing a new, defiant student body. The civil rights movement, while seeking justice, was met with televised violence in Selma, Alabama that same March. The culture had to respond. That hopeful, forward-looking spirit of Camelot was gone, replaced by a brooding, existential questioning. The polite folk songs of 1963, with their simple answers and righteous optimism, suddenly felt hopelessly inadequate. The youthful angst that Paul Simon had written about in his bathroom was no longer a personal, poetic fancy. It had become the national mood. The country was now filled with 10 million young people who felt exactly what the song was describing: a creeping darkness, a failure of communication with the older generation, a world where people talked without speaking about the war, about civil rights, about the very meaning of their country. The sound of silence was no longer a metaphor. It was the deafening quiet in the American living room as families stared at the evening news, unable to explain the violence and chaos they were witnessing. The song's audience had been born, but they hadn't yet found the song, and the song, in its acoustic form, was not loud enough for them to hear. It needed a new voice. It needed a bridge from the quiet coffeehouse to the electric, amplified world of this new, angry generation. That bridge would be built by one man in an act of visionary genius and stunning artistic betrayal. Tom Wilson was not just any producer at Columbia Records. He was a force of nature. A black man navigating the overwhelmingly white music industry, he was a visionary with impeccable taste and an audacious streak. He was a Harvard graduate who had produced the final albums of Billie Holiday. He had signed Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, and Sun Ra, artists who were the antithesis of commercial folk. He was a man who understood jazz, folk, and rock and roll, and he saw the lines between them as suggestions, not borders. Most importantly, he was the man who had just produced Bob Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home. He was the man who had put the electric instruments behind Bob Dylan, birthing the entire genre of folk rock. He had been in the studio for Like a Rolling Stone. He was the one who encouraged Dylan to abandon the acoustic purity and embrace the chaos of a rock band. He had stood with Dylan at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival when the crowd erupted in boos, furious at the perceived betrayal of their acoustic messiah. Wilson wasn't just following a trend. He was at the fiery center of its creation. He had weathered the storm of folk purist anger and come out the other side with a new sound. By 1965, Wilson was at the epicenter of this new sound. He was actively looking for the next folk rock hit, and he had a hunch. In the year since Wednesday morning, 3 a.m. had failed. Something strange had started to happen. Small pockets of college students, first around Boston and later in Florida, had discovered the original acoustic version of The Sound of Silence. They were requesting it on local radio. A DJ in Boston, the night owl Dick Summer, had begun playing it regularly, tapping into the late-night angst of his student audience. The words were connecting. The song's description of darkness and alienation was being embraced by a young audience grappling with the post-Kennedy world. Wilson, hearing these rumbles, realized he had an asset. He had a song whose message was perfect for 1965, but whose sound was stuck in 1963. He decided to drag the song, kicking and screaming, into the modern era. On June 15, 1965, Tom Wilson made a decision that would change music history. It was an act of unparalleled audacity. Without consulting Paul Simon, who was thousands of miles away in England, believing his music career was over, and without telling Art Garfunkel, who was back at college studying for exams, Wilson booked a studio session. He pulled the original master tape of The Sounds of Silence, that delicate, intimate recording of 2 voices and 1 guitar, and he prepared to operate. This was not a remix. It was an invasion. Wilson brought in the top session musicians of the day, the same electric warriors he had used on Dylan's sessions: Al Gorgoni on guitar, Bob Bushnell on bass, and Bobby Gregg on drums. These were not folkies. These were rock and roll musicians, the wrecking crew of the New York scene. They were told to lay down a rock track over the existing acoustic song. We can imagine the scene. Wilson threading the tape, the musicians listening with mild confusion to the delicate, earnest harmonies, and Wilson saying, "Okay, now give me Like a Rolling Stone." The session itself was an act of audacious, almost brutal superimposition. The musicians had to thread their parts around the existing, slightly fluctuating tempo of Simon's original guitar, a track that was never recorded with a click track or metronome. They were essentially playing along to a finished record, trying to find a groove where one wasn't originally intended. Bobby Gregg, the drummer, would later recall the challenge, having to anticipate Simon's gentle human tempo changes. Bobby Gregg's drums came in, not at the beginning, but on the second verse, a steady, driving beat that instantly grounded the song in a new, urgent reality. The kick and snare added a heartbeat, a sense of nervous propulsion. Bob Bushnell's electric bass added a pulsing, nervous heartbeat, a low-end throb that the acoustic version never had, anchoring the angelic harmonies to the earth. But the masterstroke was Al Gorgoni's electric 12-string Rickenbacker guitar. Its bright, jangly, Byrds-esque riff, an echo of Mr. Tambourine Man, was the perfect counterpoint to the song's dark lyrics. This was not a coincidence. The Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man, released just months earlier, was itself an electrified Dylan song, produced by Wilson's Columbia colleague, Terry Melcher. Wilson was taking a page directly from the playbook that was currently defining the sound of a generation. He was taking Simon's dark poem and giving it the jangling, electric armor of a Byrds hit. It was the sound of 1965. It was the sound of folk rock. It was the sound of nervous energy, of electrified angst. It sounded like a persistent, ringing alarm. In a few hours, the deed was done. Wilson had taken Simon's vulnerable acoustic lament and clad it in electric armor. He had grafted the nervous system of rock and roll onto the poetic soul of folk. The result was a hybrid, a Frankenstein's monster of a song. It was the original track, still there at the center, but now surrounded, amplified, and utterly transformed. The sound of silence now had a backbeat. It was no longer a whisper. It was a declaration. Tom Wilson knew exactly what he had created. He and the Columbia promotion team began pushing the new, electrified single to radio stations, targeting the very college markets in Boston and Florida, where the acoustic version had first shown signs of life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The song was a perfect sonic fit for the moment. It was literate and smart enough for the folk crowd, who recognized the lyrics and the voices, but it had the electric punch and the driving rhythm that the rock stations demanded. It was the bridge between two worlds, and the audience was waiting on the other side. Released in September 1965, the single began its unstoppable climb. It entered the Billboard Hot 100 chart in November. It just kept climbing, week after week. The song was an avalanche, a force of nature that the label could barely keep up with. Its success was a grassroots phenomenon, driven by listeners who heard their own confused, anxious, and disillusioned feelings perfectly reflected in this new, urgent sound. The jangling 12-string guitar sounded like a persistent, ringing alarm. The steady drum beat was a somber march, and those two angelic voices, now floating over this electric storm, sounded like ghosts in the machine. Voices of pure poetry trapped in a harsh, industrial world. The juxtaposition was startling and addictive. The lyrics, once so personal, now felt universal. The darkness was no longer a bathroom in Queens. It was the shadow of an assassinated president, the jungles of Vietnam, and the looming threat of the nuclear bomb. The vision softly creeping, that left its seeds while I was sleeping, was no longer a poet's dream. It was the creeping dread of the 6 o'clock news, the slow-motion nightmare of a nation losing its way. The 10,000 people, maybe more, talking without speaking, hearing without listening, were no longer an abstract poetic image. It was the silent majority, the older generation, the establishment. It was the generation gap personified, the inability of parents to talk to their kids about the war, the lies from the government, the feeling that society was just a collection of disconnected, silent individuals. The neon god they made was the most chilling prophecy. It was no longer just a critique of commercialism. It was the flickering blue light of the television set, the new national altar where people bowed and prayed and watched the world burn, silent and apart. The sign flashed out its warning. In the words that it was forming, took on a terrifying new weight. The song was a runaway freight train, and the men who had written it were the last to know. The antagonists in this story, the ones who had to confess to being wrong, were the artists themselves. Their failure had been so complete that they had moved on with their lives. In London, Paul Simon was living the life of a struggling artist, playing for pennies in folk clubs. He had just recorded his own solo album, The Paul Simon Songbook, which also featured a quiet acoustic version of the song. He was playing in a pub in Essex for £10 a night. He was writing intricate, deeply personal songs like A Most Peculiar Man and Richard Cory, furthering his introspective acoustic craft. He picked up a copy of Cashbox or Billboard, a routine he did to keep up with the music scene back home. And he saw it. The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel climbing the charts with a bullet. He was, by his own admission, horrified. His first reaction was not joy, but anger. This was not his song. This was a monstrosity. Someone had taken his intimate acoustic creation and covered it in schlock, as he would later describe it. He was offended as an artist, feeling that his work had been defaced, like someone painting a mustache on his private canvas. The rhythm was all wrong. The instruments were clumsy. It was a violation of his artistic intent. To him, it felt like a gimmick, a betrayal of the folk purity he had been pursuing, a return to the commercialism of Tom and Jerry. Back in New York, Art Garfunkel, deep in his mathematics studies at Columbia, got a frantic call from Tom Wilson. "Artie," the producer said, We've got a monster." Garfunkel was baffled. He had no idea what Wilson was talking about. He had to go out and buy the 45 RPM single himself to even hear what had been done. His reaction was one of stunned amusement. He could hear the hit, but he couldn't believe the audacity. He later said, "It's a fine record, but it's not us." But the verdict came from the public. The song's ascent was unstoppable. On January 1st, 1966, "The Sound of Silence" hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, displacing "We Can Work It Out" by the Beatles. The avalanche had reached the peak. They had not just scored a hit, they had knocked the biggest band in the world off the top spot. The song was, officially, the biggest in America. Columbia Records, the label that had written the duo off, was now in a panic. They had a #1 hit and no group. They had no new album to sell. A call was made to Paul Simon in London. "Get on a plane, now. You have a hit record. You need to make an album." Simon, still deeply ambivalent about the new version, was a professional. He flew back to New York. He and Garfunkel were reformed, not by choice but by popular demand. They were rushed into the studio to create an album around their accidental hit. The resulting LP, titled "Sounds of Silence," was a hasty affair, cobbled together from Simon's solo songs from his time in England, like "I Am a Rock" and Kathy's Song, which were also given a similar folk rock treatment, and new compositions. The album was, in essence, a rescue mission, a product manufactured to capitalize on a hit that had fallen from the sky. The album cover itself was a confession of this new reality. The two men, no longer the smiling, clean-cut boys of their first album, stare out with a look of detached, moody coolness. They are walking down a wintry road, looking alienated and pensive. They were now, unexpectedly, rock stars, their new image dictated by the sound their producer had forced upon them. The failure of 1964 was now the foundation for one of the most successful careers in music history. The story of "The Sound of Silence" did not end with its chart success. Its legacy was permanently cemented a year later, in 1967, when director Mike Nichols, captivated by the song's themes of alienation, made it the musical centerpiece of his film, The Graduate. This was a stroke of genius. Nichols, a director who was acutely aware of the generational divide, was reportedly using the song as a temporary track while editing, but he found that no other music worked. The song was the film. It wasn't just background music. It was the film's soul. He famously commissioned Simon to write new songs, but kept returning to Silence, eventually using it 3 separate times in the film. The new songs Simon did write, like Mrs. Robinson, would become hits in their own right, but they were born from the context Nichols had created using the sound of silence. The song became the internal monologue for the main character, Benjamin Braddock, played by Dustin Hoffman. The film opens with it, as Benjamin's face, blank and disconnected, floats past the camera, his eyes already hollow. As Hoffman floats aimlessly in his parents' swimming pool, fully clad in scuba gear, a symbol of his own suffocating suburban prison, the line, "Hello, darkness, my old friend," plays. He is cut off from the world, hearing only the sound of his own breathing. As he stares blankly on the moving walkway at the airport, a famous, iconic shot, he is a man disconnected from the world rushing past him. The song articulates his profound drift. As he sits silently in his car, the song fills the space his own words cannot. The film made the song immortal. It was no longer just about a national mood. It was now the definitive anthem for an entire generation's post-collegiate drift. Their disillusionment with the plastic, suburban world their parents had built, and their inability to communicate their own profound sense of emptiness. The song that was written before the great national trauma, and then forcibly altered by a producer, had now found its perfect, final context. It had, in a sense, come full circle. It began as a song about personal alienation, was transformed by Tom Wilson into an anthem of national alienation, and was then cemented by Mike Nichols as the ultimate anthem of personal, generational alienation. What began as a 21-year-old's private poem in a dark bathroom became the defining statement of post-Kennedy America, was forcibly mutated by a visionary producer, became a #1 hit against all odds, and was finally enshrined in cinema as the anthem of an entire generation's alienation. It is, perhaps, the most profound happy accident in pop music history. The original acoustic version is still beautiful, a pristine artifact of a more innocent time. But the electric version is the one that matters. It is a cultural document, a testament to a time when America's optimistic, can-do spirit was shattered, leaving a void. Tom Wilson, in his audacious rogue act, simply gave that new, troubling void a voice. He heard the darkness in the lyrics and gave it a heartbeat. He didn't just remix a song, he recontextualized a nation's trauma. He found a quiet lament and, by strapping it to an electric guitar and a drum kit, turned it into the sound of silence itself, the deafening, anxious, and universal silence of a world that had suddenly and permanently lost its way.